the workshop on Indian development. One of the things that we've had some sort of feedback and people have been asking about is what do other disciplines have to say other than economics about the idea of development? And of course, this is a big topic and one that obviously is of great interest to a lot of people here. We've tried in various sessions to have different approaches. We've had, for example, Sudhir speak about law and development. We've also had a historian, Aditya Mukherjee, speak about the history of development. And then we've had Akhil Bilgrami, day before yesterday, speaking about philosophy and development very broadly. Today we're very, very pleased to have Professor Chandan Gowda from Azim Premji University, who is a trained sociologist who will be speaking about the idea of development. In fact, as you can see, that's really in his title. Chandan is, as I said, a professor here at APU, but he's had his training at the University of Michigan. His interests, if I'm read things carefully and correctly, are to do with broadly the idea of development in the pre-colonial and colonial eras and afterwards. And I believe that might be what we're speaking about today, or what we'll hear about today. And also about various issues such as discussions about language rights and so on, and that kind of pervade our discourse today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Gowda.
Those of you who have taken an interest in the history of economic thought in modern India will immediately know that there isn't a single good book on what made up economic thinking in the 19th century. The only one reliable book of its kind is B.N. Ganguly's, written in 1978, Professor at DU. And you have Sunil Khilnani bemoaning this fact in The Idea of India, that we don't have a book, and here I am again bemoaning the very same fact. And I haven't done that task myself, but my dissertation research was on the state of Mysore in the late 19th and early 20th century. And it was impossible not to encounter the word development if you study the political history of the state at that time, and it's impossible not to feel intrigued enough to follow up on where that idea may have come from, and which is what I did in one of my chapters in my dissertation, and this is an occasion for me to revisit that chapter. In what I've basically done by way of method for uncovering the conceptual architecture of development is basically to look at the speeches and writings of the political elite of Mysore, who for me are made up of the Maharaja and the Diwans and the bureaucrats, and which is actually an extensive body of writing, many books and volumes, and build from there, try to recuperate rather what the intellectual lineages of this development thought might be. And in doing this, I've been guided by a method that Kwame Anthony Appiah uses in his book on race called Color Conscious, where he says, if you heard the term race in late 18th century, early 19th century US, it was still not popular vocabulary, and you may have felt sure that there was semantic deference on the part of the ordinary American. If you asked him what race meant, he would have said, ask Jefferson, ask somebody else. And I think I submit the similar situation prevailed in the case of development. And I feel completely justified in restricting my focus to the speeches of the political elite to be able to get at what this might have meant then. A very quick introduction to those of you who may be unfamiliar with the modern history of this state. This is, 2/5 of the geographical territory of British India consisted of, what are condescendingly called princely states, because the emperor was in England. And this unfortunate usage has persisted in Indian historians who routinely use princely states as if it's an objective, self-transparent indicator of a kind of polity. So Mysore is here, third largest princely state, population of about 5 million in 1900. So all of these princely states are governed by what was even then called indirect rule, by which basically British, made them subsidiary rulers, and they had to affirm their subordination to the British rule, and provide annual subsidies in return for some kind of autonomy in running their institutions. And this is what intrigued me too, given the, in Indian historiography, princely states have been mostly overlooked, both because nationalist movements didn't occur here in any dramatic manner, and also because it was an embarrassment to realize that the Maharajas were actually lackeys of the British and actively connived with the British to put down any nascent freedom movement aspirations. But given the little autonomy they had, they tried to do things, and which is what interested me. So instead of seeing them as complete stooges of the British, I tried to see how did they exercise the limited agency they had, and what did they do. And the state of Mysore, you have strong evidence that they tried to develop the state. And another interest of mine in doing this research was to somehow stretch back the history of development practice, self-named as such, self-identified as such, by at least 70 years. If you look at the codified literature on development studies, almost all of them begin with the Harry Truman doctrine, including the Development Dictionary will say the same thing. Post-1945, you are the cutting up of the world into three worlds, and the concerns of development become writ large. But even the word development has a much older currency. And what might that have meant then? The state elite of Mysore initiated numerous programs of economic development within the limited autonomy they had. James Maynard, the political scientist of Mysore, has noted that the monarchs and the divans of Mysore were heroes in the eyes of nationalists throughout India, since they provided evidence of how splendidly Indians could govern themselves. An exclusive focus on Mysore is not to suggest a Mysorean exceptionalism or the autochthonous origin of its elite's discourses. In fact, the discursive field around development was not contained within Mysore. Many of its certitudes and elite were part of the discursive traffic across British India and outside. David Ludden, the historian, in fact, if there's one chapter that I should have probably circulated before I came, is a chapter by David Ludden called India's Development Regime. It appears in a book called Colonialism and Culture, edited by Nicholas Dirks. So he notes in this chapter that, the foundations of India's development regime were laid between early and late 19th century. The massive knowledge accumulated by the British in the form of land surveys, maps, censuses, ethnographic documentation, crop, soil irrigation, mineral data, formed the basis of standardized instruments of rule and the centralization of the colonial state's administrative functions. I will not get into a very charged controversy here about, arguments like this have been construed to mean that, centralization in administrative techniques predated the British. Statistics were already in use before the British came, so colonialism is not really a violent interruption or a new violence. It's a continuation of existing centralization tendencies that are already here. And let's not get into that, but David Ludden could be faulted for laying out an argument that doesn't privilege colonialism as the initiator of development, because he's saying surveys existed before. The word development surfaces in the Mysore elite's political vocabulary in the late 19th century with reference to economic matters. In 1881, Diwan Rangacharlu stated, I quote, "The development of the various industries on which the prosperity of the country is dependent equally demands our consideration," unquote. A few years later, Diwan Seshadri Iyer noted that the high-ranking nations of his day had, I quote, "considered heavy protection duties not too high a price to pay for the fostering of new industries and have reaped the reward in the rapid development of their mineral wealth," unquote. In early 20th century, development continued to signify primarily a concern with economic issues. In 1918, Diwan Vishweshwaraya observed, I have a quote. This is an address at the Mysore Representative Assembly. Every progressive nation is aiming to secure for itself better organization, greater cooperation from its people, improved methods of manufacture, cheap supply of raw materials, and increased enterprise and trade. The developments we have undertaken in Mysore are in consonance with the trend of this new thought. We have in a small way educated the people to the importance of economic development, unquote. Often synonymous with economic development, development was a sub-component of a more expansive concept. This becomes evident in Vishweshwara's declaration. I quote, progress, if it's to be sustained, should be many-sided. But in the present state of the country, economic progress with which we are concerned demands our chief attention, unquote. I've already mentioned that the source of my archive, or my archive consists of the speeches that the Polite gave at the assembly discussions, the council discussions, and at the exhibitions. But they also gave speeches at schools, professional associations, inaugural ceremonies of hospitals, hostels, during installation of electric facilities, water pumps. It's a wide field where the elite are holding forth on what they understand by development. On many occasions, a speaker would cite from predecessor speeches, rendering a textual continuity in the space of this development discourse. Many of these speeches were circulated to libraries all over the state, even outside. Local newspapers frequently carried excerpts from them. An examination of these speeches and writings on development across 6 decades reveals the consistent operation of 4 key discourses, and I'll spell each one of them in some detail a little right now. The first one is neo-mercantilism. The second one is utilitarianism, the third is social evolutionism, and the last, Orientalism. Despite the frequent interarticulation among these discourses, they are analytically distinguishable, as the following sections should make clear. And this, I'm not trying to reify them as insular discourses, independent of historical processes. They're very dynamic, they're changing in response to changing historical circumstances. The first one, neo-mercantilism. Historians have noted the key influence of the neo-mercantilist writings of Friedrich List, an economist from Germany, who lived between 1789 and 1846, on Indian nationalist economic thought. B.N. Ganguly, the person I just mentioned a while back, the economist and historian, has pointed out that the principal focus of attention of the 19th century Indian intellectuals was, I quote, the anti-laissez-faire doctrines of List, unquote. Another historian has also observed that the macroeconomics of this period was based less in classical economic theory than in, I quote, the ideas of the German historical school, and particularly those of Friedrich List, unquote, from whose work the economic nationalists drew, quote, the basic arguments for infant industry production, unquote. Rana Day, one of the most influential among the first generation of nationalist economists in India, formulated, according to Sukumaya Chakravarti, I quote, an approach to Indian development along the lines enunciated by List, unquote. List, as we know, was an opponent of the free trade theory that Adam Smith was famously associated with. And here there's a misreading of Adam Smith by List, which has been recognized by historians of economic thought. So List says Adam Smith's theory of free trade presumes no national boundaries. So he is for a cosmopolitical economy, whereas countries like Germany, who are not as advanced as England at that time, needed to be protectionist towards itself if it had to have any chance in competing with the rest of Europe. So for him, a national economy was important to foster before he spoke about a cosmopolitan economy. But there's enormous dispute within intellectual historians about the validity of, or the correctness of List's reading of Adam Smith. Be that as it may, List was important for our thinkers in the 19th century India. See, the power of List's argument in colonial India can be perceived in the words of an economist at the University of Mysore. I keep coming back to the local to be able to go back to see why any of these global claims may be valid. I quote, the infant industry argument has been immortalized by Friedrich List. It has gained so much popularity in Mysore as to be exalted to the level of an axiom, unquote. Unfortunately, or perhaps understandably, or not surprisingly, List presumed colonialism as a natural state of affairs. He presumed colonialism as a permanent political economic feature in the world. In fact, the possession of colonies for List was a sign of a developed economy. So List does not have the colonized world in mind. He only has Europe and the US in mind. But our readers his readers in India are creative and editorial in their own relationship with List. They conveniently overlook these sides of List and often refute them. But for them, rhetorically and polemically, it's important to invoke a European economist to be able to say that, here's an economist trying to argue against laissez-faire. And how can you expect a country like India to do well when Germans themselves want protection? If you're interested, List's location of difference between Europe and non-Europe rested on a theory of environmental determinism. For him, countries who enjoy tropical climate were innately indisposed towards enterprise and activity because of the hot climate. And even this climatic theory of economic development had, and maybe we continue to have, I think, takers. So someone like Granade would accept that as a given. Yes, it may be true for now, but it need not continue to be the same. We can pull ourselves out of it. And this is where the space of creative agency comes in. It's not simply mimicry. It's not simply blind appropriation of an idea. It's trying to reposition that idea in a way that's convenient on grounds of self-respect even, not just on theoretical validity. In addition to the basic presumption of a nationally bound economy, other mercantilist tenets also guided the Mysore elite's imagination of development. Chief among them was a calculated economic orientation towards the population. The early mercantilists of the 17th century harbored, historian Heckscher has said, a fanatical desire to increase population, as that was a source of wealth-generating labor. Although this view lost force consequent to the ascendance of the Malthusians, cautionary attitude towards population increase, rapid technological innovations in mid-19th century, which suggested an unlimited capacity to manage the needs of a growing population, tempered the Malthusian demographic alarmism. Indeed, an anti-Malthusian view of population was an important component of List's economic philosophy, which affirmed the power of machine technology to sustain demographic expansion. So even in India, you have the British being alarmed about overpopulation and the Indian economists speaking back saying that's not an objective fact, it can be corrected for by good production levels. Right now what we have is underproduction, which is not matching up with this. The Mysore elite also shared this view of population as an important constituent of a nation's productive powers. Although they did not favor a large population, they viewed it as an economic asset that could be harnessed to increase the state's wealth. An early instance of this view is found in Diwan Rangachalu's annual address to the MRA. I have a quote. Now England supplies the greater portion of the world with cloth and other manufactures, the result of numerous individual men devoting their intelligence to effect small discoveries and improvements from day to day in their several occupations, which in their aggregate produce such marvelous wealth and general prosperity. What then may not be accomplished if the large population in this country once entered on a similar career of progress, unquote. This is analogous to the obscene phrase demographic dividend that we encounter in the press today. That India has a demographic dividend. We have a large population of people under age 30, and what wonders could we achieve if they all set to work and produced value. Another illustration of this attitude towards population is seen in Diwan Vishweshwaraya's address to the Mysore Economic Conference in 1915. I quote, our town population, which is less than 1/10 of the total population, is inadequate for industrial needs and should be increased to 1/5, unquote. In the early decades of the 20th century, the elite made explicit reference to Mysore's connectedness with a worldwide system of economic transactions. This could not be so given the First World War had impact on what is happening here. The Great Depression is having an impact on what's happening in the Mysore economy. So you can't continue to fantasize about being able to have complete control over a locally, geographically delimited, territorially bound economy. But the rhetoric continues. The language continues. There isn't a recalibration of the language. So the elite continue to imagine the Mysore economy as a body of producers and consumers whose interests are reconciled in the functioning of a national economy. The second strand of intellectual discourse that one can clearly identify is utilitarianism. Eric Stokes has provided a detailed account of the important relation of utilitarian philosophy to the formation of British colonial policies in India. And we might as well remember that it's not a clear, simple, unanimous application of one principle. There's a wide-ranging appropriation of this doctrine. The land revenue systems varied between South India and North India, which shouldn't have happened if they were strict about applying just one principle. But there was enormous freedom on the ground to British officials who insisted that this method be followed here, that method. But the government must have the key utilitarian objective of maximizing happiness by securing the institution of private property and allowing each individual to pursue self-interest. This idea at least found token affirmation in the language used at that time. An ideal political system reconciled liberty and security and laid on individual action no further restraint than was beneficial, whereby happiness would be maximized, unquote. This is from Stokes. Whereas James Mill, perceived the device of representative democracy to ensure a steady check on any possibilities of despotism in England, he ruled it out as an option for India where Oriental despotism was inherent to its political institutions, unquote. See, this colonial paternalistic pedagogic relationship where they said, you do not know self-government, but we shall teach you, is mirrored in the way the Mysore elite saw their own relationship with the people in Mysore. The real and long-term interests of the Mysorean population, we know best, seems to be the elite conviction. As is well known, the classical utilitarianism evaluated action in terms of its consequences towards the happiness of the community. Happiness, therefore, is a touchstone concept for judging utilitarian merits of an act. The utilitarian model of government had appeared to be politically valid for the Mysore elite all through the 19th century. In 1874, Diwan Rangacharlu had affirmed, I quote, "In this utilitarian age, social institutions could only hope to stand by their capacity to meet the wants of the people," unquote. The rulers of Mysore had been schooled in utilitarian philosophy by private tutors. This we all know. So it is common for the Maharaja to declare that the objective of the government was to promote the happiness of the local people. As we know, utilitarianism was a radical philosophy when it was first introduced in England. Jeremy Bentham and James Mill, they were trying to do away with the monarchical power. They wanted to say that the purpose of the justification for any policy ought to be seen in what it meant for the mass of the people, not what was divinely ordained or ordained by the monarchy. So for them it was a coup of sorts against monarchy in England. But the concept of utility was gradually absorbed without its ethical content across other domains of thought such as neoclassical economic models, rational choice theory, and more generally a capitalist business ethos. It became seen as simply a yardstick for measuring the utility of something devoid of a larger moral philosophy that tried to justify means in relationship to ends. Although utilitarianism surfaced in the elite discourse in Mysore in its original avatar as moral philosophy, its instrumental version appeared more frequently. An orientation towards the world solely based upon considerations of utility or use is exemplified in a few concepts that we find to recur. Concepts of waste, efficiency, productivity, and energy, which extended analytical leverage in the elite's calibration of the desired means of economic development. Anything deplorable locally could be deplored in terms of waste. Caste disputes result in waste of mental energy. These are abstract calculations of value lost. and they should be redirected towards economically valuable activity. And efficiency was constantly heard, no surprises there. Things like, peasants who worked only a part of the year, illiteracy, lack of awareness of the ways of the civilized, improper business ideals, unconcern with one's health. All of these were seen as so many instances of waste and inefficiency. From the vantage point of an economism that presupposed these matters to be connected with fostering the national economy. The third major intellectual discourse that I find working in these, in the elite imaginations of development is Orientalism. And I presume most of you are already familiar with this thesis. I mean, it's now almost passé. You mention it and we move on. It's done its round for the last 30 years and done its round quite well and successfully. By Orientalism, Edward Said, referred to the complex set of discourses produced across a range of intellectual activities, be it art, social science, geography, philosophy, which posited an essential difference between the societies of the East and the West, or the Occident and the Orient. This apparatus, this intellectual apparatus, Edward Said famously, pointed out, was even possible because of the unequal power relation between the colonizer and the colonized. But this discourse of Orientalism, of course, would be more durable if the colonized themselves were to accept its validity and used it. It's been one of the famous Orientalist claims, a spurious one, is that Indian civilization has an essential basis in religion. And this informed a lot of thinking among Indians at that time. Indological views of Hinduism as a religion that had degenerated from the 7th century onwards informed 19th century colonial cliches about the stagnant and unchanging nature of India. Further, as the historian Michael Addis has shown, scientific and technological progress came to be perceived as a sign of civilizational and racial superiority in the late 19th century. Again, technology becomes a key arena where one could demonstrate one's capacity to be civilized and modern. So Indians continue to have this anxiety that we are somehow failing in technology. I mean, just recall, this is just not history in the sense of something remote in time. Each time one of our Agni missiles, misfires, just read the newspaper items closely. There'll be a deep regret, a deep sense of embarrassment that we went wrong once again. And somewhere, we aren't good enough on the realms of technology. Okay, from the vantage point of these Orientalist discourses, the political, economic, and cultural institutions of Mysore appear a deviation from their counterparts in the Occidentalized West. If the West was modern, scientific, efficient, energetic, and progressive, then Mysore was traditional, non-scientific, inefficient, unenergetic, and backward. It's important to recognize the Mysore elite's selective acceptance of the spurious Orientalist claims. For example, their visions of development do not engage with representations of Indians as cunning and deceitful. A probable reason for this avoidance, in addition to the paramount consideration of self-respect, is that they did not see meaningful variables for explaining economic backwardness in Mysore. However, the elite concurred that the local people were indisposed towards industrial discipline and valorized the importance of modern technology. There's a chapter in my dissertation which simply argues that the state supported a loss-making iron plant simply on the grounds that it was good to have a modern factory around. It would mean good things in the abstract. Factory discipline would be introduced. People would be accustomed to habits of modern industrial life. So what if it doesn't do well economically? There are cultural fallouts that are valuable. So very quickly, Japan occupied a very important role in the elite's imagination of development. In Japan, as an Asian country that had showed that it could develop, played a symbolic use here. This is just one excerpt from an editorial that appeared in the paper in 1930s. Japan is an oriental country which has marched forward in the West, and a country which has done it within the shortest space of time. Mysore may not be Japan, but it has nothing to lose by envying Japan, studying Japan, and by following Japan. The Mysore state sent 2 delegations to Japan just to observe how they organized their economy. This was in the early 20th century, 1905, around, yeah. Okay. Just one more delicious piece of evidence to show how Orientalist politics was so strongly at work. You know, Mysore was the first Indian state to have a nominal representative assembly. It was founded in 1881. So you have Divan Rangacharlu saying this: the universal satisfaction with which the news of the assembly's founding has been received throughout southern India, and I believe in other parts of India, refutes the assumption often made that they are not yet prepared for self-government, unquote. This is from an editorial from the Madras Times. The time when the assembly was founded, a new experiment is being tried in the Mysore state whose progress would be extremely interesting to watch, because it's been frequently asserted that Eastern nations are not fitted for such councils or such a government as that of England or the United States. For many centuries before our time, Hindus have been despotically governed, so very few of them have actually taken part in the government of their country, that they know not what real political freedom and true representative government mean, unquote. Zygmunt Bauman, the sociologist, has noted that European modernity was a perception of the world that was locally grounded in a way that implied its universality and concealed its particularism. Europe could quite comfortably talk about the universal and not be anxious that it appeared local, a possibility which did not exist in Mysore, where the state elite's espousal of the universalist ideal of economic progress was unaccompanied by the concealment of local particularism. In fact, Orientalist discourses heightened the visibility of the local particulars as so many obstacles for considerations of economic modernity. The last strand of discourse, which by now you might have already guessed, is social evolutionism, the notion of history as a progressive linear sequence of events in time. You know, we have been told is a contribution of Christian eschatology, which viewed history as a series of events testifying to the continuous perfectibility of humans. But the thinkers of the French Enlightenment secularized this story and disembedded it from religious connotations. And, the mode of historical consciousness that embeds the elite's development thought in Mysore corresponded to the discourse of social evolutionism. Though, unlike the historical models associated with figures like Comte or Marx, which purported to have discovered invariant laws of socio-historical evolution, the elite shared only a general understanding of progress as the inevitable and desirable transition of agrarian societies to industrial ones. There are many quotes from Devant. I'll spare you. You've had a surfeit of quotes this morning. There's one literary figure who said, who identified Mysore's historical trajectory as having three phases. The first phase is bureaucracy, second, consolidation and development, and third, popular awakening. He analogized these three historical phases to the sprouting of a bud, its subsequent transformation into a flower, and then a fruit. And he said these three steps were swabhavika to a country's history. So there's a confident acceptance that a certain passage of society through these phases were inevitable. The elite's evolutionist historical consciousness frequently found metaphorical analogues for progress and backwardness in select images of Western and non-Western societies. Numerous local features were held up for comparison with those presumed to exist in the West. The native doctors in Mysore were secretive, while those in the West openly discussed their findings. The local peasants did not keep proper accounts of expenditure, while their counterparts in the West did. The local landholding patterns were fragmentary and irregularly shaped, unlike those in the West. I found that economists continue to point this out as a major problem in Indian agriculture, the fragmentary nature of the holdings. And I suppose it can be a problem if you're wedded to a certain understanding of what agriculture ought to achieve. But it's not the only way of looking at agriculture. The certitudes of social evolutionism find expression in binarisms, right? Tradition versus modernity, religion versus the secular, agriculture versus industry. In each of these terms, the latter term was valorized in relation to the former term. The devalorization of the reified categories of tradition, religion, and agriculture worked to the detriment of creating a modern society in Mysore. Another of the major criminal conceptual achievements of the British was to hold forth the idea of an unchanging Indian village, that the village in India was unchanging. It was self-reliant. And this image is a very strong image. It continues to inform the way we think about villages in India today. The intellectual sort of lineages of this idea of a changeless village can be seen again in colonial officials like Thomas Munro and people like Henry Maine, whose influential work, Ancient Law and Village Communities in the East and West, emphasized heavily the communitarian aspects of Indian villages, disavowing the importance of caste or political forces outside the village. The state elite in Mysore also repeatedly objectified villages and tradition as historical and changing entities that proved a hindrance for their attempts at bringing progress. So this continues. The peasant is a problem. He's wasting his time. He's not working all through the year. He's fatalistic. He's lazy. So he should be, it's a he, I use it advisedly, he should be changed. So in this evolutionist vision, agriculture was viewed as a sector sure to become marginal in the future. And this view is shared across the Indian nationalist economic thinkers like Ranade and R.C. Dutt even. The Department of Agriculture's 1926 report on the progress of agriculture in Mysore concluded dramatically by declaring its main concern to be that of raising the condition of the Mysore village in the fullness of time to the level of the urban life of England or America, unquote. The state elite perceived a commonality between Mysore and the Western world on a deracinated plane of temporal progress. It's very interesting. Just when Orientalist discourses try to posit an essential, unchanging difference between Indians and Europeans, the social evolutionary style of coding difference on a temporal plane allows you to feel hopeful about making up for it. So you have a discourse that says, you're stuck here, there's nothing that can change your essential characteristics. And then you have this way of thinking about difference in temporal terms, as society is located in different points in time, that allows you to conceive of moving out of your present state of backwardness. So when a bureaucrat says villages are the stronghold of conservatism all over the world, and ours are no exception to the rule, he is actually claiming commonality with the entire world, saying that everyone had peasants at some point. And this is, recurs. The elite's representations of a collective self-image of a backward people departicularized local cultural differences in favor of a unified abstract subject of development, denying any contradictions between their interests in development and those of the non-elite. I have a small section on development and how it constitutes the realm of the social. Please remember, when the space of the economic or the economy is congealed in conceptual terms, it is also congealed in residual terms, the non-economic realms. And here's In 1926, Krishnaraja Wadiyar, the ruler of Mysore, pointed out that the historical past mattered for any reconstruction of Mysore's social, political, or religious polity. But this list doesn't include the economy. The omission of the economy from the list of domains that could be reconstructed only with the aid of the historical past is significant to note, because it was perceived as separate from the social, political, and the religious realms. The economy was reified as an acultural domain, unavailable as a space of intervention for traditional knowledge. This separation of the realms of the social from the economic are actually quite well spelled out in the next sort of longish quote. I'll rush you through it. All the activities not deliberately classed as administrative or economic may be said to fall under civic and social. And he goes on to identify a whole list of activities that are not economic. So issues of caste and gender, among others, were perceived to belong to the realm of the social. As I've tried to point out earlier on, the elite saw little value in Indian culture from the viewpoint of economic development. And here, there's those of you who are familiar with this argument that Partha Chatterjee made, that Indians quite conveniently divided up the domains of social life into the inner and the outer, and considered technology to be the realm of the outer and said the West was superior, but the space of the inner was that of Indian culture, and we felt proud and declared sovereignty in that realm, actually doesn't quite hold when you think of economic nationalist images of the nation. There is no inner and outer. If the inner appears, it appears as an obstacle. There's absolutely nothing in culture and religion that can be of any use in thinking about economic development. It's also important to note that alongside the discourse of development, you have other kinds of discrepant discourses. The very terms of development come to graft onto local discourses. For example, the historian Mysore noted that the concept of good government was a happy translation of the ancient dharma of rulers, unquote. So he's exemplified an anachronistic historical method and retrofitted to the past a concept that had emerged from a different spatio-temporal formation. I mean, this is just to alert us to the need for careful reading on how the idea of welfare can easily be seen as something that we've always had by assimilating it with dharma. And this is one way in which we can uncover that it may not have had a smooth conceptual trajectory. It's running into other concepts, trying to hook up with them. But the two discourses of the dharma and good government rest on different conceptions of self and community. Whereas the discourse of development presumes a secular atomistic conception of the individual self, the discourse of dharma posits a distinctly non-secular, non-individuated conception of the self. The latter's conception of the self often presumes the presence of the divine in human activities, and these two models of the self are at sharp variance with each other. One set of justificatory bases of the Maharaja's authority lay in Indian philosophical discourses of Rajadharma, clearly. A second set of justificatory basis for Mysore's ruler drew from the discourse of political democracy, where he claimed authority in the name of the people. The state's embrace of the discourse of representative government is announced in the order announcing the formation of the Mysore Representative Assembly in 1881, which stated that the interests of the government are identical with those of the people. So in this section, what I'm trying to argue is that the idea of development doesn't displace other discourse, it exists alongside. But this enjoys an unexamined authority. You can invoke this without the other, but never that without this. To make this dramatic, the Maharaja on his deathbed in 1939 sends a message to the Legislative Council saying, I pray that you may succeed in evolving a scheme that will blend Western ideas of progress with our own traditions of Satya and Dharma, unquote. The ruler's note illustrates his inability to be indifferent to the Western ideas of progress, alongside which the Indian ideals of Satya and Dharma had to coexist. The latter could only provide an ethical orientation to the world, whereas the former were accompanied by instrumental knowledges, whose value for building a modern economy was all too evident. A very short note on caste and gender. Although issues of caste inequality were mostly viewed as social and not economic, the need to ameliorate the social and economic conditions of lower castes found institutional expression in 1918 when the state decided to adopt reservation for backward and depressed castes, and similarly for women a little later. And all that I'm trying to say here, and I use a small quote, which is an excerpt from a petition of a delegation of untouchable caste to the king in 1920. We are an ancient community with a civilization, philosophy and history of which we reasonably feel proud. We are confident that also that our social condition will automatically improve with the improvement of our economic condition. Our foremost need is education, more education, and universal education. This is a peculiarly developmental style of talking about one's own history and one's own needs in the present. So the idea of development has actually introduced a new way of discussing caste, similarly with the gender, for which we don't have time. The demands for social justice in relation to caste inequity now have to be expressed within the terms of the state's development discourse. And lest we think that these ideas of development enjoyed a triumphal existence, I have a small section called Discourse Interrupted. The political elite's self-location within the parameters of development discourse indicates the latter's power in only one conversational sphere, albeit a powerful one, backed by state power. The discourse of development proliferated in theoretical and non-theoretical forms. Newspaper reports, school curricula, jokes, metaphors, caricatures, gossip, tall tales, and other constituents of the fabric of everyday conversations in various social spheres. However, the opposition and skepticism it elicited in these spheres do not permit us to view its social career in Mysore as being unambiguously triumphal. For instance, an anonymous article which appeared in a local newspaper in 1921 chided the state for not curbing the flow of people into the cities which had denuded the villages of their inhabitants. And this is the last quote. It's a line from Goldsmith's poem, "A bold peasantry, their country's pride, when once destroyed can never be supplied." So sang Goldsmith 100 years ago, and what was true in his day is equally true in the present time. So there are instances of dissent and elements of contradiction within them. The idea of development is not a hermetically sealed one. Apprehensions about the negative consequences of increasing industrialization on rural realities in Mysore was occasionally expressed in official discussions. However, such occasional caution did not destabilize the authority of the discourse of development. The political defeat and economic subjugation of the colonized clearly was accompanied by a conquest in domains of knowledge as well. The violence and tragedy of this colonial intellectual politics becomes obvious in the Mysore political elites' visions of their backwardness and development. In the context of powerful colonial accusations of civilizational weakness, the elite's view of their moral political competence came to rest on a socio-historical ontology embedded in the discourses of colonialism. Seduced by the conceptual armor of colonial empire, the elite concept of development vacillated between a self-universalizing and a self-particularizing gesture, where the terms of the universal and the particular were themselves founded in dominant European discourses. These modes of elite self-identification not only occasioned pathos, but also summoned the grounds of political agency. Their epic claims of self-failure and self-uplift, directed both to an imagined West and to a home audience in Mysore and elsewhere in colonial India, extended justificatory premises for the state's development interventions. The instance of knowledge seduction of the Mysore elite involved a non-reflexivity about the conceptual foundations of development discourse. And this is all I really wanted this paper to do this morning. You know, most of us who are not trained economists, but who know, are intimidated by the scientism of economics, by the complete, if you want to, any of our criticisms about economic policy done from spaces of, non-economics will not seem tough enough or, good enough to be engaged with by economists. And I'm even willing to believe that part of the smugness is probably well-founded. Maybe currency levels and interest rates do make a difference, and they are real in that sense. But we also know that lots of matters are up for political expediency in economic policy, and things do change given thrusts of lobbies of power. So to the extent rethinking of economic concepts can actually matter and not remain a mere critique from the outside in a self-fantasizing or fetishistic manner, what might those exercises of reflexivity lead us to? And you are in a better position to answer this than I am. I still remain a weak non-economist outsider, but I still feel there's a point to be made, and I'm just curious to know what you thought of all of this. Thanks.
Okay, so questions, comments, thoughts?
Go question by question?
So yeah, I think so. I think people are still kind of formulating their questions.
Okay. Vikar, I think you can answer that question only if you get into necessarily a great thing. I mean, the way we have understood it as school learned, college learned education. But this whole business of the model state is lots of state propaganda. The Mysore state actually stood to gain by holding forth as, and it was an important symbolic token even in nationalist politics. Like the Gandhi, I didn't use this quote here, Gandhi in South Africa, when he's trying to make a case for voting rights for Indians, and the judge says, you guys have never known how to govern yourselves. How can we trust you with the vote? He gives the example of Mysore and says the Mysore Representative Assembly is proof that we can do this. Gandhi may not have believed it himself, but he's using it to marshal an argument. So to that extent, this model state business is to be seen for what it was. It's true, I mean, it may have been better administered, but
relatively better than surrounding. So perhaps if you compare it to the Nizam state,
yeah.
Perhaps if you compare it to other parts of British India even.
Yeah.
So it seems like, I'm just sort of...
It's very difficult. The statistics of that time are not reliable. I mean, we just do not know if the revenue statistics of the state could be trusted. And, where is the Maharaja's personal account? Where is the state account? How do decisions get made? We don't know. And I would not trust the statistics of even other kinds of things. But more importantly, I wouldn't even want to get into that mode of thinking. Whether Mysore is better off because it embarked upon all of this or not. Although there is space for such kinds of comparisons as well, and people have tried to do it.
And then I have three questions. First is that, you said that the Britishers, there was a kind of criminal on their part to have posited an unchanging Indian legal system. Though no one would like to go as far as the Britishers, but still, one cannot deny the fact that for almost 1700 years, the per capita income in the Indian villages didn't change, the technology of tilling, whatever didn't change, harvesting didn't change. So there was an element, somebody coming from England or Holland who's seen dramatic changes in his own lifetime. When he comes to India and he does a little bit of historical study, he sees that there's practically no change in the number of things from Mughal Akbari to his own time. So he may be, tempted to say, well, these things don't change at all. So that's one thing that, one has to admit. The second thing is that you built your argument around four different conceptual themes like utilitarianism, social evolutionism, Orientalism, and the first one was Newman. Okay. Now, which do you see all these four as necessary for the way the Mysore elite thought, or some of them are superfluous to the outcomes achieved there? And the third question is something slightly unrelated to your presentation, but it will tangentially touch it. You said that the Maharaja often invoked ancient terminology around commodities, dharma, and whatever. So if you would know that Mysore was one of the fortresses of Oriental research. So Arthashastra, a number of things credited with the active support of the Mysore court. Now, some of the quotes or some of the thoughts that you attribute to Western influence in Mysore elite can also be traced to Arthashastra, people edited under the active surveillance of the active patronage of Mysore. For instance, in happiness of the subjects lies the happiness of the king is one of the most famous quotes from Arthashastra. Right?
But what is the Sanskrit term for happiness?
Sukh would be the root and it will be the modified accordingly. Or
that's the discursive alignment that's happening. I'm sure there are other substitutes.
Yeah. And then the second thing, for instance, mercantilist that you have to close your economy. Arthashastra is very clear about some of these things. Actually, it says that you ought not export iron or things like this which are useful. These are natural resources. And you need to admit only those imports that you cannot produce, manufacture on your own. So, is it remotely possible to the quotes that you have shared with us? cannot, I mean, very unambiguously say that it has come from the other side of the world. Is it even remotely possible that, that at the level, the Arthashastra and Dharmashastra which are being edited here also had a reinforcing impact on the elite?
Okay, starting with the last question first. The Arthashastra was discovered around 1910, 1912.
1904 and 5.
When is it translated into English?
Translated, it was edited latest by 1909, and the English translations appeared 1915, but it was available from 1905 onwards in Mysore.
No. Anyway, if it was used at all, I would not think it was used as a source of thinking. There is no mention of it anywhere in terms of saying, we did this in the Arthashastra. So, therefore we shall also do this now. So there isn't the seeking of textual anchor with Arthashastra, and which for me is enough indicator as to why, they may not have felt like being confident vis-a-vis claiming a lineage for what they're doing now. In fact, I think the Maharaja's tutors had successfully, you have to step back 120 years, and the aura of utilitarian thought must have been very, very strong for them to shed off that easily and say, now we'll just latch on to Arthashastra. The part about unchanging village, it may have been very, very tempting. Europeans fantasized a lot. They saw their own past in India. They felt these Teutonic villages must have been like this. This has been pointed out. And, but the mischief that it's played, Marx's entire theory of, the Asiatic mode of production rests on this understanding of village as a non-dynamic entity where even though the PCI may not have, per capita incomes may not have fluctuated or risen, but as a stagnant space where people are beholden to religion more than anything else, which is why there is just no economic dynamism. And for Gandhi to be also invoking that 100 years after Henry Maine must tell you how powerful that image is. And even now when people are feeling nostalgic for a village that's being eroded. But the historical point, of course, is that villages, were born and they died. People moved. There was massive migration within the country, and there was a lot of interdependence across villages. They were not self-reliant, perfect occupational division of labor. So they are also dynamic entities. So but what use does that particular representation of a village? Of what use is it in these discourses? It's to be able to diagnose a problem in a certain way and to propose a way out in a certain way. And at that level of presumption, I think we can be critical. And that is not just to be scholarly alone, but to actually open up space for other kinds of arguments. And you had another question about the four conceptual schema. Are they necessary for their thought? I don't think they were necessary for their thought, but the fact that they are there in their thinking must tell you something about how important they must have seemed to draw upon in a non-reflexive, in almost non-self-conscious manner. You spoke that language and you were sure that a certain audience would take you seriously. And their outcomes, I don't know about the outcomes. There's a huge gap between policy and practice, as we all know. Whether you may wish for the villages to be re-engineered into villages and into towns and cities, but that doesn't happen. It has still not happened. You still want it to happen in terms of Chandrababu Naidu's Vision 2020. Wanted that movement of people from villages to cities to happen.
I think that social evolutionism and Orientalism are necessary for the way these people thought. Because if you don't have social evolutionism, so then you just cannot say that the linear progression. And if you don't have Orientalism, then you cannot see that comes before in this linear progression is necessarily inferior to the it comes. So I think
okay. No,
these two, this way of thinking cannot take off in the first place.
No, I understood necessary differently. I thought you meant could they not have resorted to other ways of thinking? For this mode of thinking, they found them important and convenient. And I don't think they were actually ruling out alternatives explicitly. This seemed like the only way to think properly. There was some idea of communitarianism even at that time. even Ranade was attracted to it. He was not all for industrialization. There's some way in which you can change villages, free up the occupational sort of frozenness and allow for freedom. There were all kinds of demands, intermediate demands between industrialization and only villages. Yeah.
Actually, I'll just keep my question for later, but actually just a request. The first thing is, I don't know whether you sent chapter to them and whether
I didn't.
Will you be willing to just send
Yeah,
the chapter?
yes, I would be happy
I
to.
think very valuable for them to actually realize how to think about how to trace intellectual origins of ideas and so on. I think if you could just send it as
Yes, yeah, I'd be happy
the
to.
second thing is, after this round of questions, your final question was actually very interesting. I'm not sure everybody got it, so maybe you could repeat that question.
Yeah.
So now we go back to the...
Hi Chandan, I'm Rahul from the University of Hyderabad. I apologize, this question will be a little scattered. I'm still thinking through this, and we economists are not really trained to think very critically. And I'm sure you've also come across that there's a lot of literature tracing a modern development regime around President Truman's when he inaugurated the whole South and the North. Thinkers like Escobar, Volkswagen, Timothy Mitchell. Now, one of the ways they argue, they're not saying that development, the word was never used before, or that the concept wasn't there before, but one of the things that brings the discourse together, a whole bunch of elements come together, and one of them is, the creation of a battery of experts who come back with the whole neoclassical tools, growth theories, which sort of legitimizes them to be able to speak about this outside object, and the fact that they're looking at it from outside. Now, where do all these Maharajas and all place themselves in this discourse, because they are not either coming from expert knowledge about development, or how are they backing up, or how are they getting legitimacy to be able to speak about something like development? And is the sort of development that they're talking about similar to the sort of development that the Indian modern national state sort of appropriates or starts talking about around the time of independence?
Okay. Maybe there's another question you can take and then...
Yeah.
Hi Chandan, I wanted to ask you an argument that they should have probably, the Maharajas or the Divans should have probably had better imagination in terms of imagining a different trajectory of development, or imagining a kind of development which was not completely imported from the West. Don't you also think that probably at that point of time, that is what was upheld as sacred? To imitate the West, or to become what the colonizers were like. So, while I agree with what you're saying, I'm just trying to understand if they were justified in thinking that way, because probably they also felt that that's what the public would want out of them in terms of development. And second question is, to your mind, what would be a possible alternative development imagination that they could have come up with? Because given the social economic milieu in which they lived, I think it's a humongous task to even imagine an alternative form of development, given the fact that we had so little exposure to any fixed form of development idea.
To answer the question from the student from HCU, Maharaja did not see himself as an expert, but he saw himself as a ruler, and he would have seemed archaic if he continued to insist on his authority as being, derived from, from just some divine source, and left it at that. He also was a modern ruler, which made him speak in this language, although he would constantly also hearken back to the kingly dharma part in conjunction. So he's not speaking as an expert, but when things go wrong, when there are criticisms in the newspapers about why the state is incurring expenditure on something that is loss-making, then there's an invocation of experts, actually. You delegate responsibility to experts. The experts are in charge of this. They are, completely in command of the process. So they should, it's also a way of silencing opposition. that they know what they're doing, so we can feel assured that they're doing it in the best of spirits. In fact, a small section of my dissertation talks about expertise and how that becomes a rhetorical device, both to manage uncertainty and also to delegate responsibility outside of oneself. Did you have a second question? I mean, okay, what did it mean for the later idea of development? I mean, this is something I should do more closely, but it's very clear that the first book on planning was by Vishweshwaraya in 1936. And he was actually the chairman of the Congress Working Committee in 1938 that met to discuss economic development. But on the day of the meeting, he was asked to give a place to Subhash Chandra Bose. Maybe because he was too old for it. I don't know what the real reasons were. There are clear continuities. Definitely in the emphasis on the infant industry protection. The whole logic of import substitution rested on that. And that protective tariffs were important in the initial stages. Malini's question, they're clearly not villains, Malini. I didn't, in fact, I'm very usually careful not to give that impression. And in fact, it's easy to villainize them from the vantage point of today. But to look at them sympathetically, and also with some, not wholly so, because Gandhi was around. There were people like Gandhi, whose Hind Swaraj was already influential at the time, talking about Khadi spinning, but none of them seemed to give them pause. And why Mysore? Even within the Congress, I think Gandhi was a bit of a strange presence. They just endured him because of his importance in the freedom movement. So what clear alternatives they could have pursued, I didn't look for that question. I didn't deploy that question. I mean, could they have done agricultural development differently? But I can tell you that if you look at the publications of the agricultural department, which I did in another chapter, you can be sure the role of this particular desire to flatten out land, to have large mechanized farming, to do away with surplus population on the land, to find them alternative employment is very much there. So clearly there is, and I won't say that they're being, they're not like the Chinese planners of today, but the idea is there. And it rests in their own conviction about historical destiny. We may as well start doing something about it sooner than later. Your other question was, what was the other question? Possible. Oh, yeah, I think I answered the second question.
Any follow-ups? Yeah. Okay, so maybe, and it's very interesting and important for them to engage with that. But you could just...
he mentioned Arturo Escobar, who wrote this book called Encountering Development in 1995. He was trying to use post-structuralism to study the discourse of development, and which basically didn't take development at face value but looked at it as discourse and tried to see how it was apportioning reality in the way it represented it. But I must say, Indians, we have had the lead in dissecting development for its violence and for its thorough mismatch with India. I mean, much the CSDS in the 70s on has been at the forefront, and social movements in their own way have also shown this. One of the things that we should probably do at this university is to archive this dissent quite closely and to see when did we express our discomfort with this model of development. So I didn't want this book to be just another echo of what has already been said about why development is wrong. So, I was trying to do many things at once with this particular dissertation research. One was to write a history of Mysore that remains under-researched, try to extend the history of development by a few decades, and try to contribute to a sociology of the state that had never spoken about the developmental state as a distinct theoretical object. There were three of these concerns of mine, in addition to an abiding ethical concern, which I express with some degree of helplessness, as I try to indicate, that I would not say economics is all discourse, and then just say that it's just change the language and things will be different. I think it has wedded to a realism for certain reasons. Even when you show that certain models have failed in a spectacular way, you still can't completely then give up the importance of economics modeling. So I think to the extent that there is a real object out there, the space of economic relations, that do work independently of the language we bring to it, it's important to understand how it works. And the effects are all too clear to see, when petrol prices change or when currency regimes become unstable. I think, whatever you want to call it with any language, I think it's operating independently. But that is not to also then say that it's completely the domain of science and that there is very little that's open to well-meaning interventions that might want to think about economics differently. And this we know from the politically expedient measures that we often see the states all over the world are doing in purportedly economic matters. So to what extent does our being alert to the need for conceptual reflexivity, the need to be careful about seeing the human being as a merely a want-fulfilling machine, or seeing resources in a certain manner, as human wants are infinite and resources are scarce. That's the founding presumption on which you build. So if you want to rethink these things, in addition to rethinking them, what could we do in terms of embarking upon an initiative? And these will be divergent and heterogeneous depending on the locality we have in mind. But to the extent that you've thought of constructive ways of doing economics differently, I was curious if you had thought about anything that could be shared today.
I have something to say.
Yeah.
But try and think about the question. I'm sure there are certain things. Just try and think about what you feel. For example, look at the stuff that we have at the blackboard there. We have a conception of human action there, which we all just took for granted, which was that of self-interest. The whole model behind there is completely a self-interested model, which leads to certain conclusions and therefore certain policy implications and so on. So think about, I guess, the question that Chandan is asking is as a challenge to try and think about what are the important elements that you think are there in economics, which are really useful, and those which you think block other conceptions of development. So I wouldn't say it's an answer, but I think that at least a start would be to try and figure out when the conception of human progress became equated broadly with the idea of the want-fulfilling machine, right? And people say it's utilitarianism. I actually don't think that's where it starts. I mean, I actually think located later. And partly my reading of this comes from, you may have heard of this intellectual historian of economics, Philip Mirowski.
Yes.
I actually think that that's probably the place to locate it, where and it's a peculiar kind of conjunction of Cold War history and so on, where people stop being complete human beings with a particular. I mean, utilitarianism is consistent with many different sorts of behaviors. We don't kind of posit a particular purpose of behavior until that point of time. And I think that has actually been a very interesting thing. The human being is an automaton, right? And we have to bring in value or ethics or judgment in the back door, either as something which was through welfare economics, and then we have to take on a liberal bias, as you've all heard, right? When she first started speaking about these things. So I think that unless we understand that and we understand alternative formulations to that, we're lost in terms of trying to understand development as something different or involving a larger conception of self, at least in terms of economic theory. Having said that, I think there are certain things which economics actually has helped with, at least if you call it scienticism. I'd say scientific in some ways. I mean, and I think there is a certain understanding of a logic, if you want, of capitalism, or having categories which we don't have to start off as, we don't have to think of as arising from human wants and desires and so on, right? I mean, but certainly a logic which is set up I think whenever I start a class, I start with the definition of capitalism, and I say capitalism is a system where people own production, own the means of production, have wage labor, and purpose is profit. Right? Something like that. Simple formulations like that, I think, actually are useful, and we have logics and understandings and scientific understandings even of those logics. But I actually find it very difficult to move from that to a logic of human welfare, which is also grafted onto that. And I think that starts early, but I think they sort of disparate kind of, I wouldn't say disparate, I think theorists have tried to understand the logic of the first and its implications for the second, but only after the 50s do we use the second as kind of a substitute for the first. So that's my very brief understanding of this. But I don't know if anyone else responds.
Something else to ask him, but not on this. You said that it seems that the Maharajas did not pick up their ideas from pre-modern Indian texts because A, you don't find any trace in these speeches, and B, their tutors in 1880s or whatever were schooled in utilitarianism and it transferred that to them.
There is a mention of Rajadharma, which is in the broadly, which not mentioned in text. No. But we know Tipu Sultan had a text. I forget the name. Back then you have evidence that administrative texts did derive from older texts.
Now if you look at, for example, commentating Niti Suttar to the level before the idea of utilitarianism would have gained influence in India. So you don't really have to wait for the discovery of Arthashastra. The kunji or the key to Arthashastra is available as commentating Niti Suttar. It is simple to understand language. And but then again, maybe to argument that the speeches don't have any traces would hold. But this idea that they were schooled before the discovery of Arthashastra is not key to explaining the absence of the Indian text.
Yeah. No, because just so we don't think that this is all that is happening in Mysore. The Maharajas were patrons of music, painting, where I'm sure none of these things matter. You're resting on a completely different way of thinking of musical traditions, dance traditions. So they're plugged into another textual world. But when it comes to thinking about the economy, none of that seems to matter, either for aesthetics or for in any instrumental kinds of recommendation. And that, I think, testifies to the power of this domain of economic thought, where you don't want to embellish it with other kinds of. Yes.
The question out of this presentation, actually, I would like to know, means after independence, what means, if you can briefly summarize a sort of development thinking in some, different sets of ideology or different sets of thought process, means how development in India have took place, and as well as their means the thinking like you traced through this historical means context.
There's too large a question, and I think the speakers on the first day might have addressed this. I would think from the titles of Prabhat Patnaik's title was Debates on Planning in Independent India, right? So the answer to that question was in that talk. I don't know. No, it's a very complex question. You'll have to disaggregate it at multiple domains. The Americans get involved in community development projects. It takes on, the Cold War has brought in a whole new set of meanings to development and, what socialism means, what capitalism means, what 5-year planning, is borrowed from the Soviets. And a certain emphasis on agriculture in the first plan is also owed to the American planners who are supposed to have said this is important to do. It's a very complex story with many, many more actors. I'm not sure if I can answer that satisfactorily in the space of the remaining time. Yes, Venu.
What I
I understand, what I understand from you're talking about is the kind of linkages, historical and conceptual linkages between categories, the way categories, or particularly umbrella categories like development were constructed and their locus through power and to policy. Right? Now, the way to understand these categories, you have multiple levels. You can even understand them at a kind of a social psychological level when how they're constructed from political level. So is there any kind of linked methodology? What is available today to understand how the like this kind of both reflexive and the kind of reverse direction of causation in the way these categories are used? There's been a lot of conceptual confusion about how to understand the role, the nature of these categories, what kind of impact, are they justificatory, or are they strong causal? For instance, constructing such a category as development, to what extent did it help in bringing about certain kinds of policies whose roots were in certain kind of socio-economic power structures, let's say, or the need to, so what is the current state of the art in the way, in maybe historical studies or sociological studies to understand these categories and their role? I don't know whether my question is clear. It could be post-structuralism, it could be, structural explanations have a particular, there I don't know whether the categories are understood in the way, because your emphasis was on the construction of the category historically.
Yes. Venu, it was a multi-layered question, and I can't recall all the layers, but you must help me if I overlook any of them. Development has taken on a monstrous power today, and I'm sure it means very many different things, and it's not very many clear things either. It's a way of just saying that flyovers can stand in for development, just that and nothing more, and large airports can stand in for development. Agriculture is surely a loser. I don't see any voices in the, among the influential trying to make independent space for the independent evolution of agriculture. I mean, the dominant voices are that the manufacturing is bound to have a greater share of the gross GDP, and Ashutosh Varshney will actually tell you with conviction that the manufacturing share of the manufacturing has to go up, and the agriculture share has to come down. Now we need to think about how to move the surplus population who are in villages into gainful employment in peaceful ways. Right? So I think the evolutionary angle has not gone, It's very, very much there, but the West-East comparison is more complicated with the rise of China, and I think the field is more heterogeneous, but the sense of, the temporal politics is also very much there. When Modi says I'll make Shanghai's or Beijing's or Singapore, there is that sense that that there's a lack which we'll need to overcome. There is an insufficient appreciation or no appreciation whatsoever of what can we work with given what we have. It's all about transplanting something with something at the level of metaphors and fantasy, which can play havoc in lending justification for all kinds of policies. If you just look at the advertisements of apartments and villas, it's all about world-class homes. It's unclear what world-class refers to. It probably refers to some global measure of comfort and stylish living. But, you can promise a world-class home in the middle of a very, in a shabby surroundings, and, you're willing to proceed. This is at the level of public culture, let
me just clarify when
yes.
you spoke something. See, for instance, in the discussion of development in economics, presumably is as if development picks out it's a realist approach to the notion of development. It picks out real states of affairs in the world.
Yes.
Right? Now, what you are saying is that the category is not necessarily picking out, it's not a realist rendering of states of affairs, but rather the category is getting constructed out of certain agendas of power.
Yes.
Right? It might be a state, it might be the princely state. Now, for an economic audience to take that claim seriously, we need to lay bare the reverse flow of the construction that is happening from certain predetermined exercise of power to building up umbrella categories which have justify then the actions. Right? It is. I think that is a kind of a what do you call project of public reasoning which we need to build on. If economists have to state historical and sociological analysis very seriously.
Yes. Yeah. I sometimes feel it might be better to avoid the word development altogether, even when you want to do whatever you want to do under that label, simply because it could be misconstrued, misread in so many ways. And the question that you're asking, what does it mean in development economics as a constructive policy? Is it also laden with power, and is it an alibi for achieving something else? I think it is an alibi for achieving something else, but it need not be. I mean, if you look at the success of the Karnataka Milk Federation in the state in providing an alternate source of livelihood for small farm holding families, and everyone is into milk. That's saved them. Actually, that's helped them. And I think if you want to get into the terrain of, development means helping them, giving them livelihood means and letting them face reality, face the world with, purchasing power of a considerable kind, of a substantive kind, then you can say that this is a good model of development as opposed to something else. But I don't think the people who set up the KMF actually conceived of it in developmental terms. They may be fantastic schemes that are economically viable and socially not violent. But I think the SEZs, for example, it's you don't need any extra lesson in seeing it's daylight robbery, and it's been politicized. Although a depoliticized economic policy was politicized from day one. People are protesting, and now it's. I don't know. I think the project of development, which is unfolding itself in different ways, in mining, in the real estate sector, in city planning, in our fuel consumption. I don't know. There have been so many different ways in which the word development is invoked and and sometimes contested. But I think it would be difficult. It's better to somehow dislodge the term and think of other means to express what we want to achieve. Because Sadanand Gowda says, I've been doing development work, they want to remove me from CM. There's no obligation to explain what he means.
There are other questions I'm sure that we have. I have some, but they're more about the presentation, about Japan and so on. Maybe we can talk about it over here. But actually, this is more of a kind of set of, to talk to the students, that there's a lot that Chandan has said here, which I think will require some grappling with, right? Because I think that the kind of categories that the kind of, how would you put it? The core ethic, if you will, that he is suggesting is something that we're not used to even thinking about, right? And you had some of this when Akhil Balgami spoke, some of those thoughts. So, but it's just try to take some time. This is actually a real set of challenges. You can do a lot of the economics, all the stuff that's up on the blackboard, you can do, you'll learn. But the idea of a workshop like this is to ask these kind of questions as well. Right? What exactly are we talking about? We can, everything that we've talked about is talked about trajectories of these real categories, if you want to call it, to use Venu's terms. But what's behind that? What are the kind of philosophical commitments that we're making? What are the commitments we're making to our conceptions of our lives? And to that extent, these are very foundational and fundamental questions which you shouldn't ignore. I don't think we actually ignore in our day-to-day lives, right? But even in our intellectual lives, we shouldn't ignore. And for bringing those kind of concerns to us today, I want to thank Chandan very much.
Thanks, thank you.
Okay, and there is tea outside. We're taking a 20-minute break, so I don't know if Amit is coming. I know you have questions which are probably narrow, and we can ask Chandan also. I'm going to give him 1 minute, and then I'm going to ask him questions.
Thanks.